"Get out. Vanessa needs the seat." But what came next wasn't a breakdown. It was a billion-dollar mistake. On a desolate highway, he abandoned the woman he thought was worthless. But the biggest shock? What his discarded wife owned now. The world knew Evelyn Holston as the quiet, devoted elementary school teacher who had married Richard Holston III, the arrogant heir to Chicago's crumbling real estate dynasty. Their marriage was supposed to be a classic story, the humble girl and the privileged prince. Richard wasn't self-made like other tycoons. He had inherited his empire from his father, a fact that his family, especially his imperious mother Patricia Sterling, constantly reminded everyone about as proof of their superiority. But Evelyn wasn't born into wealth like the Holstons. She came from a modest family, worked her way through college, and built her career one lesson plan at a time. The Holstons had always viewed her as temporary, a phase Richard would outgrow once he realized he deserved someone from their world. For 7 years, she endured their condescension, their barely concealed contempt, their constant reminders that she had married up. What none of them knew, what Richard couldn't possibly have imagined as he forced her onto the shoulder of Highway 47 that October evening, was that Evelyn had just inherited $700 million from her eccentric Aunt Clara, the woman the Holstons had mocked as the crazy cat lady at every family gathering. Richard had made the most expensive mistake of his life, and Evelyn was about to teach him exactly what it cost to discard the wrong woman. Evelyn had learned to make herself small in the Holston house. Not physically, she couldn't help being 5'6", but in every other way that mattered. Small voice at dinner parties, small opinions about Richard's business dealings, small dreams that didn't interfere with the grand vision of what a Holston wife should be. 7 years of making herself smaller, and she still didn't fit. The mansion on Astor Street was a monument to fading glory, all marble columns and crystal chandeliers that had witnessed better decades. The Holstons clung to their name the way drowning men clung to driftwood, convinced that pedigree alone could keep them afloat in a world that had moved on without them. Richard's great-grandfather had built half of Chicago's Gold Coast. His grandfather had maintained it. His father had mortgaged it. And Richard was slowly, methodically selling it off piece by piece while pretending the empire still stood. But Evelyn wasn't supposed to notice things like that. "You wouldn't understand the complexities of commercial real estate," Richard would say, whenever she asked about the late-night phone calls, the tense meetings with lawyers, the way his jaw tightened when his father mentioned quarterly reports. "It's not like teaching finger painting to 6-year-olds. She taught 2nd grade. She had a master's degree in early childhood education. But in the Holston universe, her career was a quaint hobby, something she did because she hadn't yet understood that Holston wives didn't work. They managed households and appeared at charity galas wearing the right designers. Patricia Holston, Richard's mother, had made this clear on Evelyn's first Christmas with the family. How refreshing that Richard chose someone so authentic, she'd said, the word dripping with the kind of contempt that came wrapped in cashmere and pearls. Like a rescue project, very humanitarian of him. Evelyn had smiled through it. She'd smiled through 7 years of it. The pointed comments about her department store dresses, the way Patricia would correct her pronunciation of French wines, the family friends who'd ask what she did, with a tone that suggested they already knew the answer was nothing important. She'd even smiled through the renovation of the guest bedroom into what Patricia called Richard's office, but what Evelyn recognized as a separate bedroom. That had been 2 years ago, right around the time Richard stopped reaching for her hand at dinner parties and started checking his phone during her stories about her students. The morning of the business dinner, Evelyn stood in her classroom organizing construction paper while her students were at music. Her phone buzzed. Richard's text was characteristically brief. "Dinner tonight with the Vandermeer investors. Wear the navy dress, not the one with the pattern." 7 p.m. "No, please. No, looking forward to seeing you." Just instructions, as if she were another item on his assistant's to-do list. She looked at the colourful handprints her students had made that week, each one labelled with careful 7-year-old handwriting. 23 children who thought Mrs. Holston was important. 23 children who didn't care that she couldn't tell Bordeaux from Burgundy. Evelyn put her phone away and finished organizing the art supplies. She had 6 hours before she had to transform back into the woman Richard needed her to be. She had no idea it would be the last time. Vanessa Cole arrived in their lives like a designer accessory. Expensive, sleek, and supposedly essential. "I need someone who understands my public image," Richard had announced 6 months ago over breakfast, not looking up from his phone. "The Vandermeer deal requires a certain polish. I've hired a personal stylist." Evelyn had thought nothing of it at first. Richard had always been vain about his appearance, the kind of man who owned 14 nearly identical navy suits because the stitching varied by a quarter inch. If he wanted someone to manage his wardrobe, that seemed harmless enough. Then Vanessa showed up at the house. She was everything Evelyn wasn't, willowy where Evelyn was average, platinum blonde where Evelyn was honey-toned, confident in a way that suggested she'd never questioned her right to take up space. She wore cream-coloured silk, like it was armour and heels so high they should have been a liability. But on Vanessa, they looked like weapons. "You must be the wife," Vanessa had said that first day, her smile sharp and appraising. "Richard's told me so much about you." Well, not much, but enough. The comment should have been a warning. Evelyn had filed it away with all the other small humiliations and kept smiling. But Vanessa didn't just style Richard's clothes. She began styling his entire life. First came the late meetings. "Vanessa thinks I should update my look before the conference," Richard would say. Leaving at 7 p.m. and returning after midnight smelling of expensive perfume that wasn't Evelyn's. Then the changed passwords, his phone, his laptop, even the home security system suddenly required codes Evelyn didn't have. "I need privacy for business," he'd said when she asked. "You wouldn't understand the sensitivity of these deals." The whispered phone calls started next. Richard would step onto the balcony or into his office, his voice low and warm in a way it hadn't been with Evelyn in years. Once, she'd picked up the landline to make a call and heard him mid-conversation. "Can't wait to see you either. Tonight, after she's asleep." When she confronted him, Richard had looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "Vanessa is helping me prepare for the investor pitch," he'd said, his voice cold with disdain. "We're working late because, unlike some people, we understand what's at stake. This paranoia is embarrassing, Evelyn. Honestly, it's exhausting. I heard you say you couldn't wait to see her. You heard me scheduling a fitting session." Richard had turned back to his laptop. "This insecurity is beneath you. Or maybe it isn't. Maybe this is exactly who you are. Small-minded, suspicious, unable to handle the reality that my world is bigger than finger painting and field trips." Evelyn had stood there in the doorway of what used to be their bedroom, watching her husband type emails to a woman whose perfume now lingered on his clothes, and felt something inside her go very, very still. She wasn't paranoid. She wasn't insecure. She was married to a man who'd already replaced her and was just waiting for the right moment to make it official. That moment, as it turned out, was coming sooner than either of them expected. 3 days later, Richard would receive an invitation to the Vandermeer dinner, and he would make a decision that would cost him everything. But first, Evelyn needed to survive the weekend, and she needed to figure out what Vanessa Cole really wanted, because women like that didn't settle for being mistresses. They settled for being wives. The Vandermeer dinner had been a disaster from the moment they arrived. Richard had introduced Evelyn to the investors with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My wife teaches elementary school," he'd said, the way someone might say, "My wife collects bottle caps," or "My wife believes in astrology." A harmless eccentricity, a charming quirk that proved he was down-to-earth enough to marry common. Marcus Vandermeer had been kind about it. "Teachers are the backbone of society," he'd said, raising his wine glass. "My sister teaches high school in Boston. Toughest job there is." Richard had laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. "Well, Evelyn's students are 7. I don't think we can compare coloring books to calculus. He'd turned to the table. She once told me her biggest challenge was teaching a child to tie his shoes. Can you imagine? The table had gone quiet. Even Vanessa, who'd arrived late and taken the seat beside Richard that should have been Evelyn's, had looked momentarily uncomfortable. Evelyn had smiled through it. She'd smiled through the entire meal, through Richard's hand on Vanessa's arm, through the way he'd laughed at Vanessa's jokes and ignored Evelyn's attempts to contribute to the conversation. She'd smiled until they got in the car. Richard drove in silence for 20 minutes, Vanessa in the back seat scrolling through her phone. The city lights had faded behind them, replaced by the long dark stretch of Highway 47, cutting through empty farmland. Then Richard pulled onto the shoulder. "What are you doing?" Evelyn asked. Richard put the car in park and turned to face her. His expression was blank, almost bored, like he was cancelling a subscription service he no longer needed. "Vanessa is moving into the house, permanently. We've been planning this for a while now, and frankly, tonight made it clear that we're done pretending." Evelyn's heart stopped. "Richard, get out." "What?" "Get out of the car, Evelyn." His voice was flat, emotionless. "Vanessa needs the seat. We're driving back together. And I'd prefer not to have this conversation in front of her any longer than necessary." From the back seat, Vanessa's voice was silk over steel. "It's really for the best. You'll understand eventually." Evelyn looked at her husband, the man she'd spent 7 years trying to please, trying to fit into his world, trying to love despite everything. His hand was already on the door lock release. "You can't be serious," she whispered. "I'm very serious. Take your bag. I'll have the rest of your things sent wherever you end up." Richard leaned across her and opened the passenger door. Cool October air rushed in. "Get out!" Evelyn's hands shook as she unbuckled her seatbelt. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. But Richard was already pulling her weekend bag from the back seat, the one she'd packed for what she'd thought was a romantic weekend at the lake house after the dinner. She stepped onto the gravel shoulder. The sun had set an hour ago, leaving only the red glow of taillights and the distant stars. Vanessa slid into the passenger seat, adjusting the mirror with a satisfied smile. Richard didn't look at Evelyn as he closed the door. The Mercedes pulled away, gravel crunching under expensive tires, leaving her standing on Highway 47 with a leather bag, her phone, and the taste of humiliation sharp as blood in her mouth. The time on her phone read 7:47 p.m. Evelyn watched the taillights disappear into the darkness and felt something inside her crystallize into perfect cold clarity. Richard Halston III had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He just didn't know it yet. The diner was called Rosie's, a tired-looking building with flickering neon and flies buzzing around the door. Evelyn had walked for 20 minutes along the highway shoulder before the lights appeared like a mirage in the darkness. Her feet ached in the heels Richard had insisted she wear, and her dress, the navy one, not the one with the pattern, was covered in road dust. She slid into a corner booth and ordered coffee she didn't want from a waitress who didn't ask questions. The rideshare app said 45 minutes. Evelyn had no idea where she was going. A hotel, maybe. Her friend Sarah's apartment. Anywhere that wasn't standing on the side of a highway like discarded trash. Her hands were still shaking when she pulled out her phone. 3 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize. 2 voicemails. The first was a robocall about her car's extended warranty. She almost deleted the second without listening. "Ms. Halston, this is Howard Chen from Chen & Associates, estate attorneys. I'm calling regarding your late aunt, Clara Whitmore. I understand this is difficult timing, but there are time-sensitive matters regarding her estate that require your immediate attention. Please call me back at your earliest convenience. It's rather important." Evelyn stared at the phone. Aunt Clara was dead. Aunt Clara, who'd sent her birthday cards with $20 bills inside until Evelyn turned 30. Aunt Clara, who'd lived in a cluttered apartment in Brooklyn with 4 cats and a parrot that swore in Italian. Aunt Clara, who'd shown up to Evelyn's wedding in a purple pantsuit and told Richard he'd better treat her girl right or answer to me. Richard had mocked her mercilessly after that. "Your aunt, the cat lady," he'd say whenever Evelyn mentioned her. "Did she arrive on a broom, or does she save that for special occasions?" The Holstons had treated Clara like an embarrassment at every family gathering she'd attended. Patricia asking pointed questions about her little apartment and her artistic pursuits. Richard Sr. wondering aloud if she'd ever held a real job. Evelyn's throat tightened. She should have called Aunt Clara more, should have visited more, should have told her that those $20 bills had meant something, that someone believing in her had meant everything. She dialed Howard Chen's number with numb fingers. He answered on the second ring. "Ms. Halston, thank you for calling back. First, let me extend my condolences. Your aunt spoke of you often and with great affection." "Thank you," Evelyn managed. "I didn't know she'd passed. When? 2 weeks ago, peacefully in her sleep. Miss Halston, I need to meet with you as soon as possible regarding the estate. Your aunt was quite specific about her wishes, and you're the sole beneficiary." Evelyn thought of the apartment, the cats, maybe a small savings account. "Of course, I can come to your office next week." "Ms. Halston," Howard Chen's voice was gentle. "I don't think you understand. In 1998, your aunt invested $50,000 in a friend's technology startup. That startup is now Quantum Dynamics. The stock has split 4 times. With dividends reinvested and current market value, your aunt's estate is worth approximately $700 million. The diner disappeared. The coffee cup in Evelyn's hand might have been 1,000 miles away. "I'm sorry, what?" $700 million, Miss Halston, and it's all yours." Evelyn sat in the cracked vinyl booth of Rosie's Diner on Highway 47, her ruined marriage still fresh as a wound, and started to laugh. Richard had no idea. None of them did. The Holstons had spent 7 years treating her like she should be grateful for their scraps, and Aunt Clara, the crazy cat lady they'd mocked at every gathering, had just made Evelyn wealthier than all of them combined. "Miss Halston, are you still there?" "I'm here," Evelyn said, and her voice was steady for the first time all night. "When can we meet?" The Peninsula Hotel didn't bat an eye when Evelyn walked in at 10 p.m. wearing a dusty navy dress and carrying a weekend bag. Money had a way of making irregularities invisible, and Howard Chen had arranged a substantial advance within 2 hours of their phone call, enough to secure a suite with a view of Lake Michigan and a marble bathroom the size of her childhood bedroom. Evelyn stood under the rainfall shower until the water ran cold, washing away the highway dust and the feeling of Richard's hand pushing open the car door. When she finally emerged, wrapped in a hotel robe that cost more than her monthly grocery budget used to, she felt something she hadn't felt in 7 years. Clear-headed, she ordered room service, a steak she barely touched, and opened her laptop. The inheritance wouldn't be fully accessible for weeks, maybe months, depending on probate. But Howard Chen had made one thing very clear. Evelyn was about to become one of the wealthiest women in Chicago. The question was what she intended to do about the man who'd thrown her away like garbage. Revenge felt too simple, too emotional. Evelyn had spent 7 years teaching second graders that actions had consequences, that choices mattered, that you couldn't just take someone's crayons and expect them to keep sharing at recess. Richard was about to learn what consequences looked like. She pulled up the old files first, the ones from 5 years ago, when Richard had still let her help with paperwork. Back then, he'd valued her organizational skills, her attention to detail, the way she could spot inconsistencies in contracts. She'd kept digital copies of everything, a habit from her teaching days where documentation was sacred. Halston Properties' financials looked healthy in those old files, not thriving, but stable. A real estate portfolio worth approximately $200 million, managed conservatively, generating steady rental income, Then Evelyn started digging into public records. The first mortgage appeared 3 years ago, a $15 million loan against the Astor Street mansion, secured at a favorable rate. The second came 18 months later, another $20 million against a commercial building in the Loop. Then a third, a fourth, each one overlapping, each one using properties already leveraged as collateral for new loans. It was a shell game, and Richard was running out of shells. She pulled up his company's tax filings, cross-referenced them with property records, traced loan originations through 3 different banks. The picture that emerged was devastating. Holston Properties wasn't worth $200 million anymore. After debts, it was worth maybe $30 million, and that was being generous. Richard had been using new loans to pay off old ones, maintaining the illusion of wealth while the foundation crumbled beneath him. The lifestyle, the cars, the dinners, Vanessa's designer wardrobe was funded entirely by borrowed money secured against assets he was slowly losing the ability to pay for. Evelyn pulled up a spreadsheet and started calculating. 3 months. Richard had maybe 3 months before the first major loan came due, and he couldn't refinance his way out. 3 months before foreclosure proceedings began. 3 months before the Holston name became synonymous with bankruptcy instead of prestige. She sat back in the hotel chair and stared at the numbers on her screen. Richard thought he'd discarded a liability. He'd actually thrown away the only person who might have helped him survive what was coming. But Evelyn wasn't interested in helping anymore. She was interested in buying his debts. All of them. And she had exactly the resources to do it. Evelyn assembled her team like a general preparing for war. First came Margaret Torres, a mergers and acquisitions attorney who'd built her reputation dismantling corporate empires for bitter ex-wives. "I like you already," Margaret had said during their first meeting, scanning through Richard's financial records with the focused intensity of a surgeon examining X-rays. "Most of my clients want to hurt their husbands. You want to own him. That's much more interesting." Then David Cho, a forensic accountant who'd testified in 3 high-profile fraud cases and had a particular talent for tracing money through elaborate corporate structures. "Your husband's an amateur," he'd said, almost disappointed. "This isn't even creative. It's just desperate." Finally, Rebecca Cross, a private investigator who specialized in infidelity cases and had a network of contacts that made Margaret's legal connections look quaint. 4 weeks, Rebecca had said. "Give me 4 weeks, and I'll have enough evidence to bury him in any court in the country." Evelyn gave them 6. The shell companies came first. 3 of them, registered in Delaware with names like Clearwater Holdings and Meridian Capital Group. Bland, forgettable, the kind of corporate entities that existed on paper and in bank accounts, but nowhere else that mattered. Through Clearwater, Evelyn approached Richard's largest creditor, First National Bank, which held $35 million in loans against 4 of his commercial properties. The bank was nervous. Richard had missed 2 payment deadlines in the past 6 months, and they were calculating their risk exposure. "We can offer 70 cents on the dollar," David told them. "Cash, immediate closing, no complications." First National took the deal within 48 hours. Meridian Capital purchased another $18 million in debt from a regional bank that had been trying to offload Richard's file for months. Then, another $12 million from a private lender who'd made the mistake of accepting the Astor Street mansion as collateral. By week 3, Evelyn owned $65 million Richard's $90 million debt load. The remaining creditors were still negotiating, but David was confident. "Another 2 weeks," he'd said. "Maybe less. Everyone wants to get off this sinking ship." Rebecca's reports arrived via encrypted email every 3 days. October 24th. Subject and VC observed at Gibson Steakhouse. Physical contact consistent with romantic relationship. Photos attached. October 28th. Subject purchased diamond bracelet from Cartier, $47,000. Given to VC same evening at subject's residence. VC remained overnight. Security footage obtained. November 2nd. VC moved personal belongings into Astor Street residence. Bedroom formerly occupied by EH, now occupied by VC. Subject told doorman, "This is my fiancée." That last one had stung, but only for a moment. Evelyn had learned to separate emotion from strategy. Richard could call Vanessa whatever he wanted. In 3 weeks, neither of them would be living in that house anyway. The social media posts were almost funny. Richard at charity galas with Vanessa on his arm, both of them smiling for cameras like they'd just won something precious. Vanessa posting photos of their new beginning, the Astor Street fireplace in the background, champagne glasses catching the light. "Finally found my forever," she'd captioned one. The comments were full of heart emojis and congratulations. No one knew Richard was drowning. No one knew his forever had an expiration date measured in weeks. And no one, not Richard, not Vanessa, not Patricia Halston with her cutting remarks and her old money pretensions, had any idea that the ghost buying up Richard's debts was the woman they'd thrown away. Evelyn closed her laptop and smiled. 3 weeks until the first foreclosure notice. She couldn't wait. The first foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-November, delivered by certified mail to the Astor Street mansion. Richard signed for it himself, Vanessa still asleep upstairs in what used to be Evelyn's bedroom. He'd been expecting another invoice, maybe a late payment reminder from the landscaping company. Not this. Notice of default and intent to foreclose. 875 West Randolph Street, Chicago, IL, the commercial building in the Loop. The one he'd refinanced 18 months ago to cover the shortfall from the Michigan Avenue property. The one that should have had another 6 months before the balloon payment came due. Richard read the notice 3 times, his coffee going cold in his hand. The loan had been sold. The new creditor, something called Clearwater Holdings, was calling the debt immediately, citing a clause in the original contract that allowed acceleration if ownership transferred. He'd never heard of Clearwater Holdings. By Friday, 3 more notices had arrived. Different properties, different original lenders, but the same story. Loans sold, debts called, foreclosure proceedings initiated. $65 million in total exposure. "What the hell is going on?" Richard had demanded over the phone to his attorney James Morrison, who'd been handling Halston Properties' legal affairs for 20 years. "I don't know," James had admitted, and for the first time since Richard had known him, the attorney sounded worried. "These shell companies appeared out of nowhere, bought your debt at a discount, and now they're moving to foreclose immediately. It's aggressive, almost personal. Can they do that?" "They own the paper, Richard. Yes, they can do that." Vanessa noticed the change first. She'd come downstairs that evening wearing a dress that cost more than most people's cars, expecting dinner at a Linear. Instead, she'd found Richard in his study, surrounded by financial documents, his hair disheveled and his eyes bloodshot. "What's wrong?" she'd asked, but her tone was careful, measured, like someone approaching a stray dog that might bite. "Nothing. Just business complications." Complications? Vanessa had picked up one of the foreclosure notices, her perfectly manicured nail tracing the dollar amount. "Richard, this says 65 million. That's not a complication." "It's handled." But it wasn't handled. The calls started next. Business partners suddenly unavailable for meetings. Investors requesting clarification on Halston Properties' financial position. The managing director of the Chicago Commercial Real Estate Association suggesting Richard might want to take some time to reorganize before the spring fundraiser. The whispers had started. In a city like Chicago, where reputation was currency, whispers were death. Richard tried calling Evelyn. Her phone went straight to voicemail, the generic automated message that meant she'd either changed her number or blocked him. He tried her school. They said Mrs. Halston had taken a leave of absence for personal reasons. She'd vanished. "Maybe you should try to find her," Vanessa said one night, her voice tight. She'd been spending more time on her phone lately, less time in his bed. "If this is about the divorce, maybe she'd be reasonable." "This isn't about Evelyn," Richard snapped. She's a schoolteacher, for God's sake. She doesn't have the money or the connections to do something like this. But even as he said it, doubt crept in. The timing was suspicious. 1 month after he'd left her on Highway 47, his entire financial world was collapsing. It couldn't be her. Could it? The call from his mother came on a Sunday morning. "Richard Holston III, what have you done?" Patricia's voice was ice and fury. "I just received a call from Eleanor Vandermeer. She heard rumors that we're facing bankruptcy." "Bankruptcy, Richard. Do you have any idea what this does to our family name?" "Mother, the Holstons do not declare bankruptcy. We do not get foreclosure notices. We do not become cautionary tales for people who overextend themselves like common real estate flippers." Richard closed his eyes. In the background, he could hear Vanessa on her phone. Her voice low and urgent. Making plans, probably. Planning her exit. Everyone was abandoning ship, and Richard was finally beginning to understand what drowning felt like. The Cook County foreclosure auction was held in a windowless room in the Daily Center, fluorescent lights humming over rows of metal chairs. Richard arrived 15 minutes early, his father's check for $8 million folded in his jacket pocket. Every liquid asset Richard Sr. had left after a lifetime of poor investments and pride. "Don't come back without the Astor Street house," his father had said, signing the check with a shaking hand. "That house has been in our family for 80 years. I don't care what you have to do." Richard scanned the room. 30, maybe 40 people, most of them investors or attorneys representing hedge funds looking for distressed assets. No one he recognized, no one who mattered. The auctioneer, a tired-looking man in a rumpled suit, was setting up at the front podium when the door opened. Evelyn walked in. Richard's breath stopped. She wore a charcoal suit that fit perfectly, her hair pulled back in a sleek twist he'd never seen before. She moved with a confidence that made her look taller, more substantial, like someone who'd spent the last month becoming an entirely different person. 2 attorneys flanked her, Margaret Torres, whose reputation made corporate executives nervous, and a younger man Richard didn't recognize carrying a leather portfolio. Evelyn's eyes met his across the room. She didn't smile, didn't acknowledge him at all beyond that single moment of eye contact. Then she took a seat in the second row, crossed her legs, and opened a tablet like she was about to attend a routine business meeting. Richard's heart hammered. This couldn't be coincidence. She couldn't possibly. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer began, "we'll be conducting today's auction in the following order: 875 West Randolph Street, 2140 Michigan Avenue, 412 North State Street, and finally, 1847 North Astor Street. All properties are being sold as is. Minimum bids have been set by the primary creditor. Let's begin." The first property went quickly. Richard bid $3 million. A hedge fund representative bid $3.2 million. Then Evelyn's attorney raised his paddle. $4 million. Richard bid again. $4.2 million. $5 million. Evelyn's attorney said calmly. The hedge fund dropped out. Richard gritted his teeth and raised his paddle. But his father's money wouldn't stretch far enough to win everything. He'd have to choose. The second property followed the same pattern. Richard bid. Evelyn's attorney countered, cool and methodical, driving the price up until Richard had to fold. By the third property, Richard understood what was happening. She wasn't trying to get a good deal. She was making sure he got nothing. $6 million, Richard shouted for the State Street building, desperation creeping into his voice. $8 million, Evelyn's attorney responded without hesitation. The room had gone quiet. People were watching now, sensing the personal nature of what was unfolding. The Astor Street mansion came last. "Minimum bid is $12 million, the auctioneer announced. "Do I hear 12? Richard raised his paddle, his hand trembling. This was it, his childhood home. The last piece of Holston legacy. $12 million to bid a 16, the auctioneer said. Do I hear 13? Evelyn's attorney didn't hesitate. 15 million. 16, Richard countered, his voice breaking. 20 million, Evelyn said, not her attorney. Evelyn herself, her voice carrying across the room with absolute certainty. The auctioneer paused. Ma'am, I should note for the record that you're representing Clearwater Holdings, Meridian Capital, and Apex Ventures, the primary creditors in this sale. I'm aware, Evelyn said. $20 million. Richard stared at her, the truth crashing over him like ice water. She owned his debt. All of it. She'd been the ghost buyer all along. 20 million going once. Twice. The auctioneer's gavel fell. Sold to Clearwater Holdings. In the back row, Vanessa Cole stood up and walked out without looking back. Richard couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what had just happened. Evelyn stood, gathering her tablet. She walked past him toward the exit, her attorneys trailing behind. Evelyn, he managed. She stopped, turned, looked at him with eyes that held no anger, no triumph, just cold, complete indifference. You should have let me keep the seat, Richard. Then she was gone. Richard caught up to her in the parking garage, his footsteps echoing off concrete as he ran after the woman he'd discarded on a highway 6 weeks ago. Evelyn, wait! She stopped beside a black Mercedes, newer and more expensive than the one he'd forced her out of, and turned to face him. Her attorneys positioned themselves strategically, close enough to intervene, but far enough to give them space. Where did you get the money? Richard's voice was ragged, desperate. $70 million, Evelyn. You're a school teacher. Where did it come from? Does it matter? Yes, it matters, he was shouting now, his carefully constructed composure shattered. You can't do this. That house has been in my family for 3 generations. My company, your company that's $90 million in debt. That company. Evelyn's voice was calm, surgical. I own 78 million of it now, Richard. The rest will be mine by next week, which means I own you. Richard's face went pale. This is insane. You're doing this because I ended our marriage. This is revenge. Revenge? Evelyn tilted her head, considering. No, this is consequences. There's a difference. I don't understand. Aunt Clara died, Evelyn said simply. You remember her? The crazy cat lady you mocked at every family gathering. The woman your mother called a colourful embarrassment at our wedding. Richard blinked, confused. What does your aunt have to do with… She left me everything. $700 million, Richard. From a tech investment she made in 1998 that you all laughed about. Clara and her silly computer friends, your father used to say. Evelyn smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Those silly computer friends built quantum dynamics. You might have heard of it. The colour drained entirely from Richard's face. So, yes, Evelyn continued, I had the resources to buy your debt. All of it. Which means I now have a choice to make about your future. She gestured to Margaret Torres, who handed her a leather folder. You have 2 options. Option 1. I restructure your debt. You work for me, actually work, Richard, not the performance you've been putting on for years, and over the next decade, you pay back what you owe. You'll keep a small salary, enough to live modestly. Your company becomes mine, but you can stay on as an employee if you prove you're capable of honest work. You can't be serious. Option 2. I call all the debt immediately. You declare bankruptcy. The Halston name becomes synonymous with failure. And you spend the rest of your life explaining to people how you destroyed an 80-year legacy in 3 years of overlapping loans and mistresses in designer clothes. Richard's jaw worked, but no words came out. Oh, and the Astor Street mansion. Evelyn's voice softened slightly. I'm converting it into a foundation for domestic abuse survivors. Women who've been made to feel small by men who thought they were disposable. It seemed appropriate. Richard pulled out his phone with shaking hands. Vanessa she'll understand. But his call went straight to voicemail. He tried again. Same result. Evelyn watched him with something like pity. She left during the auction, Richard. I saw her. She was on her phone with someone else before she even reached her car. The phone slipped from Richard's hand, clattering on the concrete. Evelyn picked up her bag and opened the Mercedes door. You have 48 hours to decide. My attorneys will be in touch. Evelyn, please. She paused, one foot in the car. For a moment, Richard thought he saw something familiar in her eyes, the woman who'd smiled through 7 years of his condescension, who'd believed love could survive neglect. Then it was gone. You left me on Highway 47 like I was garbage, Richard. Like 7 years meant nothing. Like I meant nothing. Her voice was steady, final. I'm not destroying you. I'm just no longer protecting you from yourself. She got in the car. Richard stood in the parking garage, watching the taillights disappear, and finally understood what he'd lost. Not the houses, not the company, not even the Holston name. He'd lost the only person who'd ever actually loved him. And unlike everything else, that was something he could never buy back. Evelyn drove away from the Daily Center with the windows down, November wind whipping through her hair. Her phone buzzed. Howard Chen confirming the estate paperwork was finalized, Sarah asking if she wanted to grab dinner, a message from her school principal asking when she might return. She'd built a life once in the shadow of someone else's expectations. She wouldn't make that mistake again. The foundation would take months to establish. The company restructuring would take years. But Evelyn had something now she'd never had in the Holston house. Time that belonged entirely to her. Resources to build whatever future she wanted, and the absolute certainty that she would never again make herself small for anyone. She wasn't Richard's discarded wife anymore. She was Evelyn Whitmore Holston, 7th-generation teacher, 2nd-grade classroom hero, and as of 6 weeks ago, one of the wealthiest women in Chicago. And she was finally completely free.